Annie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Nathan. Good to see you.
I think we're still about a minute or two away, so let's just, we got folks joining the call and we'll try to get started very shortly. But again, thank you for your willingness to share with us today.
Of course.
Dr. Fox, if it's okay, you want me to introduce you and then you can introduce Annie? And I will make.
Yep, that will work.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Ramsey. I'm Executive Director at Landesky Regional Council and also Director of Mountain Area Workforce Development Board. And this meeting is about our Workforce Alignment Committee that's a part of our overall My Future North Carolina Educational Attainment Project. This is a effort that it's aligned with North Carolina's My Future North Carolina goal that by 2030, 2 million individuals between the ages of 25 and 44 will have a high quality post-secondary credential. Our region is blessed to be the pilot for a regional collaborative in the state. And so our 4 counties, Madison, Buckham, Henderson, and Transylvania, are moving forward with this effort. Just want to give a shout out to our steering committee members, Jack Cecil, Dr. Laurel Leatherwood, Jack's with Biltmore Farms, Dr. Laurel Leatherwood, President of Blue Ridge Community College, Dr. John Gossett, President of AB Tech, Dr. Michael Dempsey, Dean of the Asheville Lenore Ryan Center here and who oversees their Lenore Ryan site here in Asheville. Dr. Gene Laughlin, who is a Vice President at AB Tech, and also Dr. Bill Cederberg. We're blessed to have Dr. Joseph Fox coordinating this effort, and without Dr. Fox's leadership, I don't know where we would be. So we really salute his work. For those that herd cats, Dr. Fox is one of the best around at that, beyond many other talents. So it's a challenge to pull everyone together, but our region really is focused on this work. We've had many of our local governments enact resolutions in support of that. And in support of this goal are community colleges, K-12 schools, universities, and others. I don't know if he's joined us, but just want to give a shout out to Robert Foster. Robert is the Vice President of Vertel Hospitality, and Robert is the chair of our Workforce Alignment Committee. I will now turn it over to Dr. Joseph Fox, who is leading our local collaborative, and he can introduce Dr. Annie Phillips with Education Strategy Group.
Oh, I'm delighted to be with you all, and Nathan is just too kind. It's been a good group to work with. I see that Dr. Bill Stewart has just signed on. So just before I introduce you to Annie, just to bring us all on the same page, because I am seeing some new faces and names today. So the collaborative, as we're calling it, is looking at educational attainment that leads to gainful employment. And so we've had a year of planning. We have been blessed to have some funding from the John M. Belt Endowment, and our work groups. You are one of 5 work groups. And I just got off the group with Dr. Stewart and the higher ed work group earlier today, as well as we are developing a website. So I wanted to make sure that we all kind of know how what you're working on fits into the bigger picture. So we have a pre-K early childhood education work group. We have the K-12 work group. We have the higher ed work group. we have this group, Educational Attainment and Workforce Alignment Group. And our task is to really align strategies for that seamless transition from educational institution into the employment, into the workforce. And so our fifth group is our Policy and Fund Development Work Group. And that Policy and Fund Development Work Group is really pulling together our, not only the funding that we need, but also policies that may need to go up to the state level in terms of implementing strategies that come out of this work group. The reason I wanted to mention that was as we finished the call with Dr. Stewart and her work group earlier today, what we're seeing is a alignment and a crossover with some of the work that this work is doing around best practices that leads to folks in the workforce being able to hire people with the credentials and the skill sets that are needed. So Annie has been working with us for the last year and a half. Annie Phillips is with the Educational Strategy Group out of DC and has just been really supportive of our work on the regional level, but she brings that national focus and spotlight to the work that we're doing. So I'll let her tell you a little bit more about herself. And Annie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Let me quickly share my screen with you all. I do have a PowerPoint prepared.
And Annie, before you begin, just want to remind everyone, if you could mute yourself, make sure you're muted on your end so we can limit any background noise.
Thanks, Nathan. Well, thank you both for the introduction. I do have a confession to make. Nathan said Dr. Annie Phillips, but given all the PhDs in the room, I am just a lowly master's degree. So thank you for that. But my name is Annie Phillips, as Joseph was saying. I'm an associate director at Education Strategy Group. For those who are unfamiliar with our firm, we are a mission-driven consulting firm based out of DC. We specialize in cross-sector policies and practices to improve student transitions. All of our work centers around this idea of more students earning high quality post-secondary credentials. That could be anything from, a 4-year degree, 2-year degree, or high quality certificate or license or certification. I have been working at ESG for about 4 years now, and my work focuses specifically in helping states and communities set and meet their post-secondary attainment goals. So I was heavily involved in ESG's work to establish My Future NC, which Nathan was just talking about earlier, as a nonprofit. We also supported North Carolina in its participation in the Attainment Academy, which was a multi-state initiative around really kind of cross-pollinating what are some big bets that these states can take to meet their attainment goals. So, very familiar with the North Carolina context, have appreciated working in the Land of Sky region over the last year and a half. Today, I'm going to be focusing on findings from about an 18-month-long research project that me and my team conducted on strategies to improve articulation, as well as pathways between non-credit learning experiences and credit experiences. So obviously for this work group on the workforce alignment piece, that element of articulation and what is credit, what is not credit, how do we ensure progression and quality pathways, I'm sure is a key focus of your work. So excited to share a little and have some discussion after. So the research I was mentioning culminated in a guide called A More Unified Community College. And I do actually want to share this with you all. So let me grab this link. If you have interest in kind of seeing more of the details of the report, while our research did primarily focus on community colleges as the audience, because we're talking about non-credit industry aligned experiences, the partnership and role of employers is critical. And so, we did capture many ways that employers can work with and frankly, urge along their higher ed partners to improve these pathways for students. So would love for you to kind of keep that in mind as you're listening to this presentation. For a little background on the study, the qualitative research began in summer 2019 with interviews of national policy experts and practitioners. We interviewed over 50 post-secondary policy research, institutional, and system leaders. We conducted 5 site visits at community colleges that were really advancing the ball on this topic of pathways. They were Prince George's Community College in Maryland, Hartford Community College in Maryland, Monroe Community College in New York, the Kentucky Community and Technical College System, and Salt Lake Community College in Utah. We also engaged an expert work group who provided in-depth reviewing and strategic guidance. Those folks are highlighted in red on this slide. Just a quick note on language, because I know across kind of employers and institutional folks, it can mean different things. I'm going to refer to non-credit programs. That refers to industry-focused technical training programs. In some cases, non-credit can refer to continuing education programs like pottery or adult basic education. That is not what I'm referring to here today. Degree programs are programs leading to an associate's or applied associate's degree, kind of regardless of the credits that are offered. And pathways mean really having a clear route with identified steps from one program to the next. So the rationale, I want to start out and do some level setting with this group on why articulation is important, but also why it's challenging within the systems we've created. So, we covered a lot in the guide, but I think the rationale really boils down to 2 main points. First one related to COVID. Massive displacement as a result of the pandemic. As you can see from the chart on the right here, those with a high school diploma or less were hit the hardest by the pandemic in terms of unemployment. While we're doing better, clearly, than that big spike we had last year, we have not returned to where we were in February 2020. So there's still a long way to go. And for this population, particularly those with a high school diploma or less, short-term training, a lot of which is offered non-credit, can be the solution to find that lifeboat job, keep the lights on, and food on the table. But we also know while short-term credentials and short-term training opportunities, whether they're employer-based or institutional-based, they can provide that lifeboat job, they don't have the same payoff as higher levels of education when you look at it, particularly by race and ethnicity. You can see from this visual or this table here on the left that this really plays out in the data. So when you disaggregate earnings of certificates by race, ethnicity, these opportunities really, no matter what you study, benefit Black Americans the least. They also receive lowest wages and one of the smallest wage premiums over a high school diploma than any other demographic group. Now, there are a lot of systemic reasons for that, but certainly I think the argument it makes for me is that it's an absolute must that we guard against this idea that, training should end at just that short-term training. We need to offer opportunities for continued learning and pathways to degrees. But the fact is that actually achieving that progression is challenging within the system that we've created. There is certainly at the institutional level, but also when you think about the comparison of employer-based training programs and institutional credit-based programs, there's a stark divide in how we design the programs, right? The structure of them, the length, how we value them. There's a stark divide between who actually takes those training programs. So on the student side, non-credit students are much more likely to be older, students of color, be working, parenting students. This leads to a real and perceived stratification between the two, certainly on campus when you think about credit versus non-credit programs. It's the same with faculty and staff as well. Faculty and staff on the credit side, not the same as on the non-credit side. And again, both kind of real and perceived in that stratification. Then finally, operational differences. This is more within the community college itself, but very big operational differences in terms of the funding that students received on the credit side versus the non-credit side. The ability for students to leverage things like the library and the gym and the computer lab. Often it requires a student ID, which are only given to credit-based students. And then technology too was another big barrier that we saw, or big kind of difference between non-credit programs and credit programs. On the non-credit side, they're often using some sort of customer relations management system to track sort of student outcomes, whereas it's a student information system on the credit side. This creates challenges with how you actually track outcomes, progression, and more. So we see these challenges really, and the context we're operating in right now is sort of a call for change, and it's not simple, right? It is really a pretty big lift, but we see it as critical in this moment in time. What we sort of envision and what we put forward in the guide is an institution that's really better preparing students with skills and knowledge to succeed in their chosen path, but also continuously grow in that chosen path. And ideally, the student can seamlessly interface between workforce and non-credit programs and degree programs because those pathways have been created for them. From what we've seen across the country and kind of the research I was talking about earlier, we think this vision is achievable, and many institutions, as well as their employer partners, have started on that hard work. While many institutions and their employer partners have started, pretty much no one says like, yes, we've achieved full alignment, we have seamless pathways, we're ready to go. You know, some approach it from, you know, joint partnerships with employers and really say like, we have figured that out. Others talk about, you know, we've mastered the curricular pathways. These industry training programs automatically articulate for credit at our institution, but they haven't quite figured all of those pieces out. And so for that reason, in our playbook, we've sort of Frankenstein together what we believe is kind of a framework for alignment, a sort of ideal structure to achieve the true articulation between pathways that ultimately leads to what we want, which is student progression along those pathways. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. The kind of 5 tenets of our framework are: 1, treat all students as students. So I was talking about, you know, students in non-credit programs don't have the same access to funding. They don't have the same access to support services. We've got to address those gaps in the student experience and make sure that supports that are available to credit students are also available to those in non-credit programs. Even the language we use implies some sort of stratification, right? Non-credit students, a bit deficit-based, when really we tend to refer to our credit students as just students. The second, build pathways between non-credit and credit credentials. This is about the on-ramps and connections between programs, and it should go both ways, right? From credit to non-credit, from non-credit to credit. The main thing is that students are clear on what their next steps are to continue, whether that's now, right? They seamlessly progress now, or maybe they finish a non-credit program, continue working, and then come to get a higher level degree. The third, and this is really focused on the community college itself, is around aligning and integrating departments and governance. What we found, interestingly, a lot of the institutions that have approached this work have made it possible through joint leadership across non-credit and credit programs. And they've created essentially one person who oversees the same sort of topics, the same disciplines of non-credit and credit programs. And that integration then can begin to infiltrate into curricular, faculty, and other stakeholders at the table. I see an opportunity here to think about kind of joint leadership with employer-based training programs as well. The fourth, making programs credit worthy or credit based. So there's kind of 2 options here. Credit worthy refers to an employer-based training program that grants credit when the student actually transitions to the degree program. Maybe it's through articulation or equivalency or some sort of default credit for prior learning. The key there is that it's a relatively automatic process of credit awarding. Too often what we found was that students are supposed to kind of prove credit worthiness themselves. They have to take a challenge exam once they arrive at the institution. In a credit worthy program, students automatically receive that once they enroll at the college. The second option in this one is making credit-based programs credit-based is sort of gaining accreditation for your non-credit programs. And I'm actually gonna talk in more detail on that in a second. And then the last one, remove barriers to transition, like how it sounds, make it easy, make it clear, make it obvious, whether that's through supporting students with funding. We heard about promise programs for students who transition from an employer-based program into a credit-based program, making it easier on students' schedules, right? One of the benefits of non-credit is that there are more flexible hours, or just getting rid of other hoops that students have to jump through kind of administratively. So recognizing that institutions really approached all of this work from very different starting places. In the guide, we put forward kind of 4 different starting points for this work. And these different starting points can be chosen based on your specific community's context, your assets, and your perceived challenges. For today, I'm just going to focus on starting point 3 and starting point 4, because I think they have the most opportunity for the employer community to lead and urge on higher education. Within both of those, I'll explain kind of what the starting point is and how exemplar institutions go about the work. So starting with starting point 3, make industry-focused programs credit-based. The proposition that we are making here is that the employer community, whether a course or certificate is offered for credit doesn't really matter, as long as it's aligned with their needs and the skills that they need. But to a student, as I was pointing out earlier, offering it for credit or non-credit does matter for all the reasons, again, that I was pointing out earlier about funding. So we argue, since it is a difference maker to the students and employers, that institutions and employers should work together to ensure the majority of quality industry-based programs are offered for credit and therefore automatically count towards an associate's degree. We get, it's interesting, we get some pushback from institutions in particular on this one because of fear that the accreditation process is going to kind of slow down their ability to be responsive to employers. In actuality, this isn't the biggest challenge that we see in this one or that we heard from the institutions we interviewed. What actually slows down the internal processes are things like, getting the registrar to offer credit on transcripts for 8-week courses is in fact more challenging. So the kind of example of starting point here is the Kentucky Community and Technical College system. Rather incredibly, they started shifting the vast majority, of their non-credit courses offered across the state to credit in the early 2000s. They had leadership right from the executive level with the chancellor of the system. What they did was they sort of made the case that in order to align with state funding, which flowed directly into credit-based programs, they needed to shift many of these quality programs to non-credit. So they ended up assigning a team of faculty and staff, as well as brought in people from the employer community to develop common language, definitions, processes to kind of guide and manage the transition to credit programming. A key sort of stakeholder in this group was faculty and academic programs who also oversaw sort of workforce courses because they could kind of translate what they saw as content and quality of workforce programs as well as those in academic programs. And so now kind of the result of all of that is that when new training offerings are developed, faculty make a credit recommendation based on the competencies that they've already approved and can quickly gain credit for approval. Another kind of key here, which I didn't mention, is having a myth buster. So there were a couple of institutions that talked about having essentially like an accreditation guru who could say, actually, when there was pushback, actually, that's not an accreditation issue, that's an institutional policy issue, and we can change that policy if we want to. So having someone who's really expert there at the table can help. Starting point number 4, and I think this is one of the most intriguing starting points that we saw, reorienting for demand-driven pathways. And this is much more externally driven by employer demand. The examples in this bucket really capture the workforce development leaders who are drastically rethinking the way non-credit courses are offered. I think interestingly, articulation of non-credit and credit courses and credentials tends to be the byproduct here because employers, they don't necessarily just want certificates, they want all levels of preparation and credentialing. Because colleges at this starting point are innovative, they're not just thinking about the pathways as linear from non-credit to credit, but also the other way around, right? Credit, how can we supplement this with a non-credit certificate of some kind? And importantly, in every instance of an institution we saw sort of at the starting point, labor market data plays a huge role in their success. And I think the case study that really exemplifies this is Monroe Community College in New York. From my experience in this work across the country, very few institutions use labor market information in the way that MCCs Economic and Workforce Development Center does. And that is their kind of non-credit provider at the institution. They've gotten sophisticated enough to know the exact return on investment in the labor market to the student as something as small as a course. And they can actually identify the key points where that premium is significant enough to provide value to the student. And then they sort of create certificates or certifications to go along with that. In the case, sort of how Monroe kind of came to do that was in 2011, they developed their Economic and Workforce Development Center. They kind of reimagined non-credit because they wanted to reach more students across the region, better prepare them for employment, and create these pathways to degrees. The division, importantly, was kind of reoriented around strategic grants development. So a lot of what they did was sort of invest in, let's search for some grants to build this capacity around labor market information. And they did kind of prioritize labor market analysis and employer engagement.
Good. I'm listening to a webinar.
Within there, non-credit.
Annie, I apologize. Just want to remind everyone, please mute yourself if you're on the webinar, because we're allowing people to unmute them, participants to unmute themselves, so we can hear any background noise. I apologize, Annie.
No problem. Thanks, Nathan. Importantly, and this is a little unusual at the institutional level, but the EWDC does provide pretty high touch case managed approach when supporting their students in non-credit programs. So my point about sort of very clear pathways, they have invested in upfront advising to make sure that those articulated pathways are very clear. I think one example of how kind of building up the capacity and kind of reorienting for these demand-driven pathways has benefited MCC is that in the last year, the college actually made the decision to move all of their career services to their non-credit division, recognizing that their use of labor market information, the engagement that they had with employers was a benefit. And so, again, I think the key here is really on that data side and making sure that it is extremely employer driven and demand driven. So to kind of summarize here, I think if you're going to get started on this work, three key things to sort of drive your action. One is being student-centric, making sure that students are at the focal point, whether they are non-credit students or credit students, and build in equity and opportunity. We know that the scale is kind of balanced towards credit students at this time, so we need to address the systems and the policies and the processes that create those barriers. And I think from the employer perspective, part of that is recognizing the advantage that a credit-based program does provide to students. The second is labor market driven. Obviously, from an employer's perspective, a lot of what you're doing is labor market driven, but from the institutional perspective, I do think the collection and the analysis of that labor market data on current and projected economic needs is critical, as well as the engagement of your employer partners, focusing on high demand and high wage fields. And then finally, build for innovation, re-envision what's possible. Don't let the fear of accreditation, for example, stop you from pursuing these pathways. To really kind of foster new opportunities and use some of the evidence-based practices in this presentation or otherwise to inspire bold action. So I'll stop there. I did see that there were maybe some questions in the chat. For Nathan. Nathan, is there anything you want to kind of speak to specifically?
So Annie, we're allowing people to unmute themselves, so we can open it up for questions. But so here's the the focus of the Workforce Alignment Committee, and I think that last slide really helped exemplify that. This is really the intersection between education and employment and the jobs that we have in the community. And how can we work together more seamlessly with our employers to help upskill individuals in our region, to give them the credentials they need to advance in their career. And in some industries, it may be primarily on the job training, but there is an academic component to it because generally we know, and this isn't true for everyone, but the more credentials someone has, or certainly the high quality credentials they have, the better they're able to support themselves and their families. So, this applies to those, it may be a a welding certification or something in the skilled trades or something in hospitality tourism, but that leads to that really good job and helps meet a workforce need. So this is where we really need the input from employers and our educators on how to better align your efforts. So Annie, I don't know if that's very helpful. I did add some labor market information, my thoughts on, because I know right now employers are just really banging at the door saying we just need people. But I think, you know, how can we use this effort as a talent attraction strategy for employers, so we can say that job that we're hiring you today at, you know, $15 an hour, whatever that number is, can be a $20 an hour job or $25 an hour job in the future. And you know, in the perfect world, it would be an apprenticeship-like effort where you really integrate education and on-the-job experiences. But I probably need to stop now. We've got a lot of people on this call, and I just want to get y'all's insight. And do you have any other ideas, any insights, Annie?
Well, I was just going to say, so to the talent attraction and some of the challenges with entry-level workers, the Monroe Community College example that I gave, I sat down with students who were in their medical assistant program. Pretty much universally, like no matter where you are, there's a shortage of medical assistants. However, that's a job that doesn't pay great. It's not technically considered a family sustaining wage when you look at the data, but it is high demand. And so what they've managed to do in that community is they've worked with, you know, mainly, I believe it was like retirement homes to pay for these students to get their, I think it's like a CNA, it's some sort of basically progressive nursing credential. So they pay sort of for that advanced credential in order to keep these medical assistants like on board at their nursing home. And I think what they found, and you've maybe seen like major corporations like McDonald's make a pretty big deal about investing in their frontline workers as a way to avoid the sort of churn that happens with a lot of those entry-level positions. And I don't have the data from Monroe, although I can say anecdotally speaking to students, like this was the difference maker and then sort of continuing and progressing on. And from the workforce development dean there, that it did meet a lot of the sort of talent shortages that they had within the medical assistant field. But from a McDonald's perspective, they've done a bunch of research, and when they actually invest in sort of further education for their workers, that it does reduce their churn by like a number of months. I think it was pretty significant.
Annie, there is a question in the chat regarding, there's a couple of questions. One, do you see these kinds of programs, do they tend to increase pay from employers as well? So you're providing additional educational resources to individuals, but what is your experience there?
Yeah, ultimately the idea is that, you know, the individual sort of earns some sort of non-credit credential. They might go out into the workforce, but generally speaking, they're going to hit a ceiling on that credential at some point in terms of pay. And at that point, they have the opportunity then to go back to college, skip, you know, maybe it's the first year of coursework in some sort of higher level degree, earn that degree, and then come back and ideally sort of be eligible for some sort of higher level position and higher pay at that organization.
And there is a lot of discussion about stackable, transferable credential certifications, but you know, the system is not always as seamless as we would like it to be, as Annie mentioned. Another question, Annie, what role, if any, did philanthropy play in either of the case studies mentioned?
Yeah, so in the Kentucky example, I don't believe philanthropy played any role. I do know that Monroe's sort of approach when they started, as I was mentioning, they put a bunch of capacity into that strategic grants development. So they did pursue philanthropic funding for kind of to build up, you know, they had a bunch of infrastructure and capital costs related to some of the training programs that they were doing. Like Monroe's in Rochester, New York, and they had like a Kodak facility that they were sort of remodeling and updating. So, you know, philanthropy played a pretty big role there. But in the case of Kentucky, I mean, they really built this off of how state funding flowed. Like Kentucky now has something called a Work Ready grant, which is basically kind of a promise grant for those who want to earn some sort of high quality certificate, but it flows only to credit bearing students. So they basically leverage funding streams that already existed in order to sort of help students along these pathways.
But you mentioned a promise programs earlier, and I guess to the extent those promise programs like Tennessee Promise, other promise programs are leveraging federal, state resources, and they tend to be last dollar funding to support that. Could you provide some elaboration there?
Yeah, so I'd actually give a different example. So Salt Lake Community College, they call it a promise program, but it's incentive for a student to transition from a non-credit training program to a credit-based program. And so basically once they do, the student gets a certain number of courses, like something like their first 12 courses, or excuse me, like the first 16 or 12 credits that they take is free. And that is provided by the college. And I believe that has been state appropriated. In Utah, it's not typical that this happens, but the legislature was extremely involved in their development of non-credit to credit pathways. So I believe that was something that was sort of state appropriated to the institution.
Are there any other questions, any other alignment? I know there's a lot of, got a question here from Carol. Have you seen any particular key success factors to ensure alignment of employers' educational institution? What action steps are critical in the beginning of this work?
Yeah, I think for me, like when it's starting out, it sort of comes down to kind of three things. So I mentioned kind of being student-centric. Identifying that common goal, right, is about student success is critical, and sort of speaking about it in those terms. The second is, I think, like the ability to use that labor market information. Like, I think employers are busy, institutions are busy. The institutions that sort of come to employers and say, hey, these are the programs we're thinking about. These are the skills we want to build into these programs based on what we've seen from the data. Is that right? And validating with their employer community. Those are the relationships that I think work most successfully. And then finally is just developing like that common language. I sort of mentioned in the Kentucky example that, the importance that they placed at the beginning on common definitions and language. And I think spending some time to figure out what we mean by pathways and what we mean by even credit and non-credit is important when we kind of operate in two very different industries.
I know that we have some community college folks on the call. And so I don't want to make the assumption from an educational point of view that our employers know what we're talking about when we specifically say credit and non-credit. So I'm hoping that some of our community college folks would chime in and talk just a second for our employers on the line about continuing education training versus curriculum training. I know our earlier work group alignment, our higher ed group work group met earlier today, and we were talking about creating pathways, looking at what are the needs of the employers that are hiring the graduates in terms of identifying skill sets in graduates. But part of that common knowledge or common language that Annie is talking about sometimes get lost in translations from educational institutions to employers. So would somebody chime in around what do we mean by continuing education programs that are non-credit, that may be focused on specific industries, so customized industry training versus the pathway or stackable credentials in that make starting continuing ed that then goes to curriculum side of the house through then to gainful employment.
Don't be bashful. I'll start calling on people if no one will comment.
Yeah, I'll be happy to jump in on that. I think the key is what Annie said earlier on was aligning the student learning outcomes, I'm trying to go back to my notes, the objectives of the course, the student learning outcomes of the course. It falls on the credit side of the house to accept those experiences. And then it really falls on the non-credit side of the house to make those experiences worthy of credit while serving the business and industry needs. So, you know, I think to me, it's a healthy push and pull on both sides of our houses to create a system by which we can articulate that credit in a crosswalk way.
Dr. Leatherwood?
I'm sorry, I'm on a Zoom meeting.
Here, hold on. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Leatherwood.
I guess I was just, you know, I kind of I agree with John, but I think we have to rethink that. I think, you know, we said it's on the credit side, but more importantly, with our non-credit, that's where the emphasis is being placed. So we've got to figure out how to match that non-credit just as much as our credit. So and Andy alluded to this, our systems are set up different. And that's the challenge that we have. I mean, I think that's the significant challenge, but I mean, I think it's something we keep working at, and it should be driven by our employers.
Dr. Leatherwood, could you elaborate a little bit? I know your institution, Blue Ridge Community College, does a great job, certainly serving adult learners and also students coming out of a high school. But talk about those different populations and the different needs, because I think Annie mentioned early in the call about those adult learners that were going to get those short-term programs. A lot of that's because they don't have the time to go into a longer-term program because they're trying to pay the rent, keep food on the table, take care of their children. But there's unique needs that will help transition the needs for the youth coming out of high school as opposed to a more adult learning population.
And actually, and that's true, Nathan, but I also think that there's also more in common with high school students taking also the short-term training as well. So one of the things that Blue Ridge is doing a lot with is the articulation from continuing education into curriculum. A lot of that, and Shanda can maybe even speak to that a little bit more, but that articulation now, they can actually take that short-term credit course, right? Or a credential, become employed, but then take that credential and come back and start working on their degree and get credit for that, in addition to credit for work experience too toward a degree. So those are some of the things that we are working on that really apply to high school students and adults now. And Shanda may be able to speak even more to that.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Leatherwood. Yeah, we're looking at it from many different angles. Yeah, the working adult, as you said, Nathan, has many priorities on the table in front of them. And so number one is keeping the roof over their head and food on the table, right? So we here, any education institution has to look at how can we be more flexible? How can we meet them where they're at? It's like we all know, if we're taking a vacation trip from here to Florida, we get off. You know, we get off at this exit, we get gas, we get back on. We get off this exit, we get some food, and so forth. And that's life. And so we have to match our educational pathways to support that, and not force the student to take a course over again that they already took on the continuing education side. Many times what we do is we run curriculum classes, if you will, on the Con Ed side, because we're supporting industry with flexible for the 4-shift model. We're running it on the weekends or whatever to meet the demand of that population. And as Dr. Leatherwood said, then they're able to get, if they desire to continue their education, because really most are looking to get X to move these couple of steps, right? And so we need to be able to find the flexibility and the means in which to do that through our programming, through our scheduling, through our instructors understanding life, if you will. And so we've been working really hard at that, and so far been very successful, but you know, we haven't met the complete answer yet.
Shanda, I don't know if you're the best person to add. I know you probably can add some input, but Mark Bolton with Bolton Construction, and I know Daniel Mancuso with AB Tech is also on the call, who's over there, Applied Technologies program. We know in our skilled trades, in the construction, manufacturing type sectors, you know, we have a great challenge in attracting individuals into those pathways. Mm-hmm. And so Mark's got a question: does making more programs accredited increase student enrollment? As a local employer, our largest challenge is finding personnel willing to work in the trades, regardless of education and certifications. So it's really a interest gap as much as a skills gap. Does anyone want to take on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So when, Mark, so when you said accredited, are you meaning accredited through the community college, internal processes, or are you speaking specifically about industry accreditation? Mark, if Mark's still...
Yeah, I'm here. So it sounded like, based on the content of this presentation, was a lot more programs are going to be moving towards sort of a credit-based system where it's more working toward an associate's degree versus just little parts and pieces, like you were talking about, Shanda, that where students come in and they do one step at a time to edge higher as they work through a career versus getting a full associate's degree. Unless I misunderstood exactly what the proposal that we were speaking about was.
Well,
Mark, I think you're on point. Go ahead, Shanda.
So the community college, we're here to support and meet the student as well as the employer and what their needs are, where they're at today and where they want to go. And many times that's very different. However, what we've done with our programs is make them very stackable to where a person can enter and exit, come in, get A class and exit, and then come back and get B class and then exit, or come in, get A, B, and C class and exit. Does that make sense? To where as their time permits, as their pocketbook, of course, right now there's a lot of funding, a lot of scholarship money to support a student in achieving their educational dreams. So we build our programs off of multiple platforms, but with today's ever evolving, every busy person's mindset in mind as we're doing our planning. Does that make sense, Mark, at all? And we are doing a big focus on skilled trades right now. We are awaiting word of the creation of our continuing education career college promise pathways in our skilled trades. So masonry has been approved, and HVAC and plumbing is sitting in Raleigh right now for final signature, which is exciting because we definitely want to get back to supporting our skilled trades community.
So,
Mark, go ahead.
I have a question for you, Mark. Do you offer any training right now to your employees?
I would be happy to tell you what we offer. I'll use it as a sales pitch. So we have multiple possibilities. We do full tuition reimbursement if somebody would like to go to AB Tech or Blue Ridge Community College and get an associate's degree. We also offer a 4-year apprenticeship program. And here in about 30 minutes, we'll be doing our weekly in-person training portion of that. And the rest of it is online. It is a 4-year program. It starts at 15 and it ends at 22. Minimum pay at the end of the apprenticeship program. Mm-hmm. And that's for plumbing and heating and air. So we have some pretty strong packages, but we're just running into a lack of interest.
Yeah, I mean, the interest thing, the best advice probably I have is start younger, to what Shanda was talking about, because trades, for, whatever reason, get stigmatized somewhat early. I will say, if there are, you're doing apprenticeship, which is like Cadillac gold standard of kind of what I'm talking about here. But if you do offer like your own certifications in HVAC, for example, like working with a Blue Ridge to make sure that, you know, if they earn them on your campus, that if they want to, when they go to Blue Ridge, they can get credit for those and it stacks into, you know, a longer term degree program. That's kind of what the proposition that I was talking about today, is working with, you know, the faculty at Blue Ridge to see if you can get those somehow articulated.
And what's really interesting right now, if I may add on, and I may have missed the very beginning of this, the state has finally just approved its credit for prior learning policy and procedures. So we already had a pretty strong internal policy for that, as we've been working so closely with our employers and with our school systems. But we've even shorted up more now that we have truly some clear guidance from Raleigh. So Mark, more things now, such as employer-specific credentialing, industry-specific credentialing, work experience. Now we can take a look at that and say, okay, how does that fit into this pathway, and what can we give Annie, for example, some credit so where she doesn't have to take that class, and so she can speed up her process of success towards the end.
It's really demoralizing. Like when we talk to students, it's really demoralizing to like work in industry for 10 years and then go and be like, oh, actually, like you have no credits towards a degree. So it does kind of help with progression. The other piece that, you know, I emphasized a couple of times, but make it clear, like communicate it about it. One of the things when we talked to students was like, they didn't even know that this stuff exists. So to the extent that you can double down on how you're communicating about it, maybe at Blue Ridge, you know, in the community, I think, you know, can help too.
Yeah, and I would say with this project is slightly different. So the collaborative has a number of stakeholders, which includes all of our higher ed institutions, as well as our employers. We are not pushing a specific degree. We are going to our employers saying, tell us what your needs are in your labor force, your human talents that you're hiring, to make sure we are aligning and having those conversations with the educational providers around credentials of values. So we don't want to just offer a degree and then there's no jobs out there in our local market for that degree. So we really are hoping these type of webinars open up and enhances those lines of communications where you're saying, as Marcus said, I'm having trouble finding people in these specific areas. Our goal then is to connect those educational resource dots to help you share that information, not only on the educational side, but also in the community. So, you know, one of the things that we're doing is we are working with a web designer that I was in conversations with earlier today around what can we do in terms of a part of our websites where local employers may be able to post positions and skills that they're needing in our area. And so the web designer is taking that back to their team to say, how do we design that? Will individual employers be able to upload like into a shared calendar career fairs that they're having, job openings that they are having? So our goal is to create that or connect those resources for our employers to make sure we are offering credentials of value, the ones that you all need in terms of skill set, but also having those common conversations. So earlier we were talking and somebody from education mentioned educational outcomes and learning outcomes. Probably to an employer, that terminology doesn't resonate. You're really looking at skills and skill sets. And so part of our work is to get you all in the same room talking about the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. When we talk about learning outcomes, we're looking at the competencies and skills and abilities in that particular course that aligns with a job that's needed in the current workforce. you may be saying two different things, but how do we get you in the room talking the same language so that we can critique our programs and change those programs to meet your needs? The other thing that I mentioned earlier was the difference between continuing education programs and curriculum programs. So at the community college level, our continuing education programs are short-term programs that are focused specifically on industry. So if Mark came to Blue Ridge and said, I need training for this particular skills, continuing ed could quickly provide that training on your site or on their campus or virtual for 2 weeks, 1 week, 8 hours if that's what you needed. The stackable credentials are where you get short-term credentials on continuing education. There's a pathway to then get on the curriculum side and get a diploma or a degree if that's what that employer is asking for, as well as transfer to a 4-year degree if it's a pre-engineering position that you're trying to fill that requires that. So there are alternate pathways to get to making sure we have the labor force that you are needing. So as we're having this conversation, if you're an employer trying to think, okay, how do I fit into this puzzle? Really, you're our end user. We are trying to make sure we are graduating folks out of whatever credential level, short-term or long-term, with the skill sets that you need in your positions.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. I appreciate that. And that is exactly what I meant, is the difference between a program that is a continuing ed program versus getting something like an associate's degree. And I know that a lot of local advocates for the trades speak very highly of the apprenticeship program, which is wonderful. And you do get to walk away with that with a journeyman's card, which is nationally recognized. However, we do try to highly advocate for the local community colleges and the associate's degrees because those tend to carry a little more weight sometimes as far as maybe if they were to seek a different type of position within our organization. We've had folks move into like an accounting position or a different type of position in the office where an associate's degree had a little more value than a journeyman's certificate. But all that being said, I will say that the biggest issue that we face, I think, is just a severe lack of interest from high school graduates. It doesn't matter to me if they've been in college for 1 year, 4 years, 2 years, accreditations, no accreditations. I know, speaking from past experience trying to work with AB Tech, we tried very hard to start a plumbing program. I personally was willing to teach it, and we tried to run the course, but we could not get enough interest from students. And so that really is sort of where I'm at as an employer, is how do we spark interest to advocate for the trades as a quality career path?
Hey, Mark, this is Daniel Mancuso from AB Tech. I'm the Dean of Engineering and Applied Technology. Right now, the majority of the manufacturing and industrial apprenticeships do go through curriculum courses or course load as part of their registered apprenticeship process. So that's how so they can actually earn their associates while obtaining their journeyman status. That's how the majority of the manufacturers in this area operate their apprenticeship programs. Obtaining youth interest in skilled trades is a perennial challenge. As a society, we've basically had a 20-year history essentially of not advocating for the skilled trades, and that's a challenge to address. Locally, the majority of the students in our engineering and applied technology programs are working adults, late 20s, early 30s. They worked something else, they came back, they decided they want to get a technical degree or technical education and go back into the field. We probably have some unique demographics in this area for a number of reasons, but it is a perennial challenge to get youth interested. But that's a national challenge that we're facing as well.
This is Beth Stewart, Vice President of Instruction at AB Tech. Nathan put in a question into the chat about how do we generate interest? in these fields. And I think one of the things that we often don't think about is something that we're challenged with in recruiting for education too. And that's that when we talk about competition, it's not just Blue Ridge competing with AB Tech or community colleges with universities or a plumbing business with versus an electronics business. It's all the other things that are pulling people away from jobs and education. You know, gaming industries and the whole gaming culture. A good friend of mine who has never pursued a career because he's dedicated his entire life to martial arts training. Those other types of distractions that may keep people in retail jobs or working in fast food instead of pursuing what we would consider a much more stable job. And I think the challenge for businesses then is to how to make your career field as exciting as whatever else it is that is competition. And it's not the other job. It's those other things that are the competition. Just a thought.
Yeah,
you know, I'm sorry.
I was going to just say, Daniel, I had interviewed your predecessor, Vernon, around that same issue, Mark, of how do you get folks interested in the trade. And so Vernon, who has retired and Daniel has taken his position, handed me a sheet. I looked at it and he was like, look at how much these students can make in these trades areas. And so, you know, as I started talking to community groups, I started sharing that information. And so that's part of changing that mindset. When you're looking at the trades, folks have this misconception, or the ones that I found, they had the misconception that those are not good paying jobs. And when I started sharing that sheet with folks, they were like, oh, you can make that kind of money as a plumber, as a, you know, et cetera. So part of that is having to change that whole perception around the trades versus curriculum programs that lead to other type of jobs. And then we have to be more, you know, putting the equity lens on. We also have to be able to change how we market, not just the educational programs in general, but overall various programs to diverse communities. And so just because we build it doesn't mean they're calm. We can't just put it on our website. We really got to get out there in the high schools and share this information. We have got to get out there with community leaders. And so, you know, one of the things I mentioned to Beth's group, I pulled together a list of probably 20, 30 folks in community that work with youth groups. So getting that information in their hands, getting that information into parents' hands at an earlier age to create those pathways are going to be important. Go ahead, Dr. Leatherwood.
Well, I was just going to say, we tried something, and I think you guys may have even heard me talk about this before, but what we were trying to do, we have these robots here at the college. And I went to some of these young high school male students in particular, because they like to game, right? And the old Game Boy and all those. So they're always playing games on their phone. So what I did was, okay, if you're basically running a robot on a game, right? So I translated that into a manufacturing environment. You're running a robot, which is very much like gaming. So what I tried to do was take managing and programming that robot into the gaming world so they could understand what that profession was kind of like. And we had a few sparks out of their eyes. I mean, that's what you want. You want a spark from these high school students. So I think that we have to think different about what interests them and what is it that they know and how do we make this work look like what they know, right? And they're motivated by money. They're motivated by a shiny truck or a shiny new vehicle. So I think that we have to be very creative about how to get their interest. And I know that sounds like not really a con job, but you're trying to relate to someone you can't relate to, right?
Well, I also think that the part of the opportunity, this is Kevin from Western Carolina University, is about helping students understand the ladder climbing opportunities. We seem to have lost that. You know, that's one thing. And when I'm working with folks in hospitality and tourism, I mean, that is still a total ladder climbing set of jobs. There's not a general manager of any major hotel in Western North Carolina that didn't start off doing maintenance and cleaning and has worked in every single department that they have. And I think there's a mindset among Gen Z folks in particular that it's, you find the job and that job's got to be paying $85,000 a year. And I'm 19 years old. And that's not the reality in these, as we know. I thought Mark made a really good point about, they build opportunities to then grow and develop in the company. And in that, to your point, Nathan, a lot of times when we've talked about in the past few years about how to get students interested, I have to admit my own mindset has been about thinking about who's here. But I'm now finding that the room's empty and that we've got to do our work to pull folks into Western North Carolina. We got to serve who's here, but we clearly don't have enough folks to fill the positions. And, we can pull a Pratt & Whitney in, and the reality is they'll start to take away from existing employers. And then we're going to have the same trouble about how do we do that. And we're with this tight labor market, it's getting, when my mom calls me yesterday and says, I just passed Burger King in Candler, and there's a sign that they're starting at $17 an hour. That's going to, that really puts into a bind in a lot of our other manufacturing and trade related positions. So I agree, Nathan. I think we're getting called more and more that we're going to have to get earlier and earlier, and even outside of our region, to pull people into Western North Carolina.
We got a question from Scotty about if we've done a survey of students, and I don't think Christy Cheek's on the call. I'm not sure, but Christy helped lead a survey, included a lot of our CTE directors. I think we ultimately had like 5,000 students respond to that survey. And we found by far the greatest influencer of a student's career choice was their parents. And so, even if a student said, hey, I want to be a plumber, I want to be an HVAC technician, I want to be a mechatronics technician, if their parents say, no, you don't need to do that, it's really hard for them. So I know we would need to be respectful of everyone's time, and others may have other meetings, but any thoughts on that? And I know we may have some folks on the call that are familiar with that survey. Rich?
Nathan, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rich Price, Executive Director of Economic Development and Regional Partnerships at WCU. New into my role, but I've spent 7 years plus as a local practitioner over here in Jackson County. And I appreciate this conversation because I think it demonstrates sort of the glaring gap that we're facing in being able to create what, from a marketing perspective, we call a value proposition. And the work that this group has done and continues to do with creating this alignment effort to our educational and training credentials and resources is tremendous. But there's still that piece out here that's missing on how we can demonstrate both to young people, those who may want to be in mid-career and want to change, and then the most recent example of to parents, the value in so many of these careers that are prevalent and are quite frankly starving throughout our region. And I don't have that answer, but I really feel like that's going to take a vastly creative effort on the part of employers, educators, economic development practitioners, and the like to really come up with creative mechanisms for creating a value proposition for these different careers. It was challenging pre-pandemic. The pandemic is now just, quite frankly, it's exacerbating that. And my colleague Kevin brings up a great point as I ride by Sonic Drive-In in Silva every day and see $17 an hour just after I've seen a commercial on television for Eaton Corporation offering starting pay at $15.50. So we've got a real marketing issue ahead of us as well to quite frankly point out the obvious.
And I'll leave with one final point. I know we're trying to wrap it up, but I just wanted to, I believe Fraser was mentioning about climbing the ladder and the opportunities for advancement. And that is true. There are certainly going to be people that are aging out of the workforce and I'll need to be filling positions. But I will tell you from where I sit, the biggest challenge is not filling office positions. Those are desirable positions with, frankly, applicants. I don't even have a job posting for a project management position, but I have applications coming in. I think that we may be coming to the time where wage scale begins to get smaller for management staff, office staff, and increase for hourly workers because of the severe lack of people willing to do that kind of work. I think that there are a lot of people that don't want to do the hard manual labor and physical work and would like the office position, which has its challenges, and you have to have somebody with a good head on their shoulders. But at the same time, the number of folks wanting an office position is there. I can fill those positions. I cannot fill the hourly field positions. And that's just a very interesting dynamic that we're facing right now. And I'll end with that.
And right now is a really crazy labor market. So it's not based on historical. Normally when you have recessions, you have spikes in enrollment at community colleges. People, go to career centers. We really didn't see that at this time. But to your point, Mark, and I don't know what the number is, but if we exclude those really high demand areas like engineering, nursing, healthcare occupations, which we know that the demand for those are out the roof and those jobs pay very well. For jobs that pay over, $50,000 a year or so, maybe 60,000, I don't know what that number is. We generally can source that talent outside of those occupations I mentioned earlier. But for those lower paid positions, it's really challenging. And, if you look at housing cost increases and other things, a $17 an hour job sounds great, but go out and try to, rent an apartment. So I know there's a squeeze by employers, but I agree with you. We generally don't have and I hate to use those terms, but filling white collar positions. And that's where maybe we're a little different. We did this labor force study. So, like in the Triangle, they had a tremendous demand for 4-year degrees or more. And with more biotech jobs, with Google, all those type of jobs, they're really, pushing individuals that need 4-year degrees or even beyond to fill those positions. In our region, we definitely have a need for that. But I think the more significant pressure is on those other types of jobs. But I may be wrong, but that's just my anecdotal understanding of our labor market. But any parting comments? I don't want to take you too long. I know it's after 5 o'clock, but we had a great attendance at this meeting. We'll follow up with another workforce alignment meeting. Our goal with the workforce alignment group is, my future NC is not about education for education's sake. And we all believe education is a powerful tool, but it really needs to be aligned with what our employers in our region need. And so this is the group that puts up a sign and says, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. We need to go in this different direction because, y'all are driving what our labor market and employment needs are. So are there any final comments, Dr. Fox or others?
Yeah, I think you summed that up well, Nathan, that you all are the driving force. And I think that's, and that's why I wanted to pull us back to the discussion of what are the skill sets that you need in your labor force. And so just FYI, we're currently working with the data person at AB Tech to develop a more specific driven survey that we'll be asking you all to participate in around your needs. Now, we're not going to drive it down to the lower level, but just, what alternative sources of recruitment are you finding that you're reaching out to? So we're hoping to really start some communications there around, are you when you reach out to a college, are you reaching out to HR versus are you reaching out to program directors that may know of graduates that are in that particular field? Are you reaching out to club advisors if they have an electronic club? So trying to get more specific around what your needs are, but also how can we reach those diverse communities that may be underrepresented in your employment. So you'll be hearing more about that as we do that.
Any other comments before we end this call? Well, I added in the chat, I know Rich mentioned that ad for Eaton, and I do think it is about careers, and Eaton, their HR team is really focused on, we don't refer, this is not about a job, it's about a career. Eaton actually is a really good employer that helps upskill their individuals, the workers, and I've met so many people at Eaton that have got an associate degree, a 4-year degree, even a graduate degree, and Eaton has helped pay for that. But, so I think this career awareness interest gap, we're going to have to, come out with our recommendations. We definitely need to address that as part of this, this effort. And we do have a white paper of top priorities. And I think that aligns with several of those priorities. If you look at aligning our pathways and increasing work-based learning, really the focus on work-based learning, and that includes everything from a job shadow to an internship to ultimately a registered apprenticeship would be the Cadillac of that. That's all about exposing people to careers, letting them see what it's like, so they have they can say, yeah, this is something I'd love to do. So any comments before we end this call? Annie had to leave, but really appreciate Annie's leadership and her presentation today. Thank you to all those who have provided your input, either verbally or through the chat. Dr. Fox, again, thank you for your leadership and facilitation. And please reach out to me if you have any questions. You can reach out to me at nathan@landofsky.org. If you need to reach Dr. Fox, I can get you in touch with Dr. Fox, and we will be glad to try to help support your efforts and help us get to a better place so we can find some answers to these challenging questions. So again, thank you so much for staying after, and that shows the passion that our community has, because I think we might could meet to 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, but if we were in person, we'd provide some beverages, and Shanda, I think, take care of those from a Henderson County establishment or something, but she works with so many breweries in our community. But y'all have a great day, and again, thank you for joining us today.